Hey Adam, thanks so much for joining me today.
Hey Fabian, thanks for having me.
No, I really appreciate you making time for this. To kick us off, would you mind just giving me a little bit of context to your professional journey?
Yeah, definitely. I grew up in Southern California, and I knew I wanted to work in automotive. I didn't know how or why, and I didn't know where the journey would take me. But ever since I was a kid, as a car guy, I wanted to work in automotive. And um, basically, my first job out of college, undergrad, was with Mercedes-Benz on their fuel cell project. I thought I was going to work on other Mercedes products, but they put me on the fuel cell. And what I saw there was, the whole vehicle propulsion, even the way the vehicle is fueled, even the vehicle architecture, it was all about to change. This was in the early days in 2010. There was still a lot of comparisons between fuel cell electric, battery electric, and I didn't know how things were going to play out, but I knew I wanted to be a part of the evolution of the automotive industry. And so from there, basically did my best to work at the most interesting, cutting edge parts of the automotive industry with the biggest problems that they'd let me work on. And that took me to high powered public fast charging with EVgo, which at the time was the largest public network in the US. Um, Also to autonomous vehicles with Cruise and General Motors in Arizona and San Francisco, which a lot of fun. And then Rivian deploying the commercial vans with Amazon, which was a whole nother level of rigor and effort needed to work with a partner like Amazon and deploy critical infrastructure for charging in vans. And then ultimately, I thought it's time to do something entrepreneurial. I'd been in the industry for some time. I'd been living in California. Much of that I moved around to Arizona to Germany, but ultimately went back to California. And I thought, why not? And why not me do something interesting? And this problem around EV charger reliability kept coming up. It's something I saw many years ago when I was at EVgo. And me and my co-founder, who was a close friend of mine from college, we basically came up with a clever algorithm that used data from the charger to sort of diagnose and infer what the problem was and when a problem would likely occur, like a probability of failure. Basically, treating a charger like how you and I would be treated if we went to a doctor and said, my back hurts. And they'd ask, did you do a lot of cycling this week? Did you not do any exercise this week? Like what's changed? And we applied sort of that methodology to EV chargers. That company got bought by 7Gen at the end of this past year, and I've been working with them since, and it's been great. It's been a wild ride of up and downs in the startup, but also automotive generally. And I've really enjoyed it, and happy I chose to work in the industry.
No, thank you so much for the overview. It's super fascinating. Also, the sort of different types of organizations you've worked with, from some of the larger scale or with incumbents to some of the speedboats in the industry, and then um, yeah, with your own entrepreneurial journey, super fascinating. Loads of topics that I would like to come back to, but maybe just to set the scene when it comes to AVs, or generally autonomy in automotive, there seems to be a little bit of a gap between sort of the hype and the reality that we currently see on the ground. How would you describe the state of autonomous vehicles right now?
I think that it autonomous vehicles is going to be one of those things that the first time anyone gets in one, and I'll use my wife as an example, who's extremely smart and capable and better than me at most things. She was scared and wasn't sure what to think of when she got in her first AV. Um, and when we went for a ride, and at the time this was in San Francisco, and at the time the cars were capped at 25 miles per hour. And the first few minutes of the ride, you could tell she was a little uncomfortable and not sure what it was like. There was no safety driver. This was truly driverless. And then, after a few minutes of seeing the car demonstrate good judgment and behavior, she was like, okay, but like we're running late for the reservation. We got to get there. And I think what's going to happen with AV from a social perspective, I think it'll be a lot like what happened with her, where she was not sure and then took a ride and saw that it demonstrated enough safety that, compared to a regular typical rideshare driver, that she was comfortable with it. From a tech perspective, I think you're going to see a lot of, what is probably like a lily pad, like a frog sits on. You'll see little cities, LA, San Francisco, Austin, other places, London, hopefully in the future, where the technology will start, and that will be because the vehicles are trained to drive there and know how to behave properly in those cities. Every city has differences, and from there you'll see what starts out as a small circle of a few mile radius or a few kilometer radius grow and grow so that you go from just a downtown rideshare service to a larger full city rideshare service. I think and you're starting to see that. You see that in LA, where I grew up. It started out on one side of the city and now it's growing and growing. The biggest unlock that has is starting to happen now is basically two things. Once the AVs can safely go at highway speeds, then they're going to be able to traverse larger parts of cities and maybe go between cities as well. There's plenty of testing going on. If you go to San Francisco, you see Waymos and other self-driving on the highways, but they have a safety driver. So they're still not there yet for like you or I to get in those cars, but they'll get there. There's no reason it won't get there. And that has to do with the sensor's perception being far enough and the latency for decision making being quick enough. The other unlock that you're also just starting to see is going to airports. As trivial as that might sound, most rideshare services, many of their riders go to airports. I can think of myself, most of the time I'm using Uber or Lyft, I'm going to the airport. And airports, especially in the States, but everywhere, there's a lot of traffic and congestion, and they're highly dynamic areas of people pulling in and out of parking stalls or in and out of pickup drop off areas. And so because of that, it's difficult for a human to drive there. I hate driving to the airport. And so it's difficult for an AV to drive there too. Waymo's starting to do that at the Phoenix airport in called Sky Harbor. It's a little bit of a simpler airport. I used to live in Phoenix, so I've seen it, but that's the start. And once they get good at that and they expand to larger airports, plus the highway, then we'll really unlock more areas.
What would you say are, if you can point to sort of three key areas from that time in terms of sort of personal learnings of working with a dynamic company like Cruise? Are there sort of three plus minus one sort of key takeaways that stand out to you personally and or professionally?
Yeah, I think the 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 feeling at Cruise was really around what is something that we could make that would have such a global, huge impact. In the same way, a lot of other Silicon Valley tech companies talk about these grand visions around changing the world, how Uber transformed mobility. I mean, taxis existed before Uber, so we weren't without. And but Uber made it easy, and Uber often talks about it being turning it to a magical experience. And yeah, having gone from taxis to Uber, being old enough to remember both, Uber is better. And I think Cruise had that too. How do we make the journey and change the world being easier and safer? And I think aiming really high for like a moonshot type project was something I took there. There was a lot of moonshot type terminology used throughout Cruise because of that. And so I think that was one major takeaway. And I think another takeaway was you had Cruise, which was with this Silicon Valley ethos for better and for worse. And you also had a company like GM, which is, on the other side of the country, steeped in automotive tradition. And you had the merging of these two. And some of the best engineers I worked with were at GM, and some of the smartest people I worked with were at GM. And I think another big learning for me between those two is how do you mesh those cultures together? And sometimes that was easier and sometimes that was harder. That's just people. But how can you get the know-how, the expertise that GM had, and those teams and those people that I worked with and are still doing great work. Many of them are still at GM, and and mesh it with this sort of moonshot, let's go out there and change the world mentality that Cruise had, for like a young startup type company.
Mm. Yeah, super, super fascinating. And then afterwards, you moved on to Rivian. What specifically was your role at Rivian, and what was your involvement in the transaction with Amazon, which was quite, I mean, there are lots of documentaries about it, but what was your personal involvement in that?
Yeah, totally. So I left Cruise because while I'd been there for 3 years and we'd done some really exciting work, um, I wanted to do something that was a little bit more immediate. There were still many years until Cruise could commercialize, and frankly, it was 3 or 4 years until Cruise ended up having that accident and winding down. So it was still earlier days of Cruise. At Rivian, I felt like I could make an impact in a very quick and immediate way. And what I did there was, they wanted to build a practice around hardware, software, and services for fleets of EVs and charging them. And that would be all sorts of different offerings. And if you go to the Rivian website and you click fleet, you'll see they've got a fleet vehicle and they've got all this fleet equipment. And so I was hired there to work on that team and lead a lot of that work and lead a team around that work. You know, After the company became public and priorities and the nature of going from a private company to a public company occurred, I thought there was an opportunity for me to transition to another team focused on ADAS and self-driving technology because of my work at Cruise. And I had met the VP of that team, and we hit it off. And so um, he brought me onto his team, and in that capacity, I was really focused on, like you're saying, Fabian, the relationship between Rivian and Amazon. And I was the connection point for all things related to driver assist, safety, and vehicle automation. So Amazon would um, take delivery of the van, and then I would work with them around some of the product planning for features and safety and additional things on the van. Um, and that was, Amazon famously has a culture around um, decision making and these memos and the sort of perception of one-way and two-way doors. There's all of this, like you mentioned, around discussion around Amazon, and I was neck deep in it. I was meeting with Amazon all the time, and I was meeting with the Rivian team and relaying a lot of that as related to vehicle automation and all of that. And it was a great experience. It had many ups and downs, as any business relationship does, and I enjoyed my time and I learned a lot. I feel good every time when I'm back home in California. I see the Rivian Amazon vans, knowing that I played a small role in
Mm.
deploying those, and specifically those ADAS on them.
I find working as an internal product manager quite hard, where you have a smaller number of stakeholders and a team where you potentially have a higher degree of control. But it sounds like quite a complex um, stakeholder dynamic, and then also in an environment that's arguably really uncertain to some extent, but then also just very complex when it comes to some of the safety features. You have drivers that probably have sort of different requirements. Operationally, looking at it sort of from a product lens, how did you manage this relationship between your teams, your internal stakeholders, so your senior peers and other stakeholders within Rivian, but then also the Amazon stakeholders in terms of prioritizing, road mapping, etc. So the sort of day to day.
It was hard because you had, as you're saying, you had, I was a Rivian employee and I was working with the Rivian team, and there's all those constraints as you feel in any company around engineering or product resources. And then you had Amazon and my partners on the other side that, you know, they were Rivian's largest shareholder and largest customer at the time. And so it was important to keep a really strong and healthy relationship between us. And I liked the folks who I worked with on the Amazon side as well as the Rivian side. So it made it a little bit easier. But um, basically what that looked like was doing a lot of exercises around what are the most critical things, Amazon would want on the van. What are their priorities, whether that's safety or driver convenience or some sort of efficiency metrics. And then speaking with the Rivian team and understanding, well, how hard would that be to develop given what you're saying, Fabian, in terms of different drivers may behave differently. So a feature that's built and works really well for one driver driving style or one city, a city that's predominantly high speed highways versus low speed
Mm.
delivery in urban areas, and really going back and forth between the two and being a sort of transparent and good partner to both sides, letting the technical and development teams at Rivian know why and how Amazon wanted things done, and letting the Amazon team know why and how sometimes it could or couldn't be done, or it could be done at a different timeline or anything related to actual deployment. And like anything, it was easier and hard at different times. But for me, I think it was really trying to understand and convey what Amazon wanted. Like, they're all rational actors. Why did they want this in this way? And the Rivian team, why did the Rivian team want or prefer something this way? Also rational actors. And
Mm.
me being stuck between and trying to arbitrate and basically share those points of view. Um, and yeah, it taught me a lot around basically, like, these were two different entities. We're all rowing in the same direction on that boat, but sometimes you've just got to help one side understand the other side and vice versa, so that they could understand that. Even if I did, because every day I was with both teams.
Mm. To, promise that's the last question on it. To what extent did you have to articulate the financial value that specific areas of work contribute? Was it more on the sort of end where, as long as you develop products that are desirable to the end users and the sort of one of the main customers with Amazon, that's a job well done? Or did you have to define value, including the financial value, for sort of specific improvement areas and areas of your product more granularly? Asking for a friend here because we face very similar questions every day.
So to answer your question, I had to do both, right? So there was internal transfer value, like within Rivian, how it would work from one team to the other be valued. And then there was actual value to Amazon in terms of we need to do some additional development in this domain. And this is something that you would have to pay for. And so, like, again, this had to happen. This happened a lot and was a big part of my job. I had some good help within the Rivian org as well to do that. But you know, it's never easy. There's no formula to do that, right? There's time, there's effort, there's the amount of people working on stuff. There's tactical things in that way. Um, and so basically went through that exercise with many features. So definitely had to do that.
Hmm. And then following that, you embarked on a new journey with Energized AI. How did this journey start? How did you come up with the initial idea? What did the sort of initial process look like with the team that you've been involved with? And also, how did you convince yourself that this is a good idea, or was this so obvious to you that this is something that I would want to do? Because I think it's sort of a question that loads of people working in product related areas are wondering about. Okay, we see this problem here that no one is really addressing to that extent. Should we sort of leave our day job and build something essentially? So there were quite a few questions in there, but let's maybe start with how did the sort of journey begin, including your thought process, and then some sort of follow-up questions to that.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I mean, I think very, very straightforwardly, like we were like many American households, we had two cars. As a car person myself, I had I had a Porsche Cayman, like which I loved and drove, and I missed that car. It's my desktop background. And we also had an EV. We had a Tesla for a while, and then we had a Rivian. We were one of the first Rivian R1S owners, and loved the Model S and loved the Rivian R1S even more. And we would do road trips all the time, like the whole family, dogs in the car. And on these road trips, we would visit chargers all over the Western United States, up and down California to Arizona, Denver, everywhere. And kept running into the problem that became more and more well known around showing up at a public charging station and a third or half of those chargers not working, two of the four not working, that sort of thing. And that is that's really a bummer because not only does the that show a level of like actual failure for what is necessary infrastructure, but because charging times can be 20, 30, 40 minutes, maybe even longer, having half the amount of chargers sometimes meant a line, and that's not ideal. And so I kept running into this. um, this was something also that there are many media companies picked up on too, even like mainstream. I think some big paper like New York Times and stuff had discussions around EV charger reliability. So I kept seeing this. And I remember from my time early in my career at EVgo, I would actually use and manipulate and do some of the data analysis for EV chargers in the early days because we were a small company and sort of everyone had to do everything. And it was a lot of fun. And I remember that the problem had to do with sometimes the charger doesn't send correct signals. And there's a lot of reasons for that. That's a whole nother podcast, but just know that a lot of times the operators of these EV charging stations don't know the status of the station, if it's offline or what the problem would be. And so I would do some of this in Excel analysis many years ago. And because I kept running into it, I just thought like, this is something that could be automated. This is something around the same time ChatGPT came out, and I had become much more familiar with other forms of automation, even like classical ML, and basically was like, why don't we just do some of that? And why don't we use some of the context around the charger, how it's been performing, how historically it's supposed to perform, what its last few charging sessions were, temperature, all this data that we called the composition. how could we just use that to help provide better data to these charging operators so that they could understand what was going on with their chargers more. And yeah, I convinced a friend to help me with it, and we put it together. And I think that might have been more in depth about the problem and what we did than you asked for. But the reason I'm giving it is it was a real problem. Like, I was stuck on road trips waiting in line at chargers. This wasn't a hypothetical, and this wasn't like a pretend. And so it was a real problem. It's not solved. Our startup, we did some good work. We didn't solve it. It still is a problem. And um, we wanted to build something to address it. And I think that another part of it is growing up and spending a lot of my career in California, whether that was Southern California or the Bay Area. You see so many people working on startups. And there is a level of comfort I think people have with doing the startup um, journey or taking that startup risk, that when you're swimming in that water and you look around, you don't even know that it's that risky because that's what everyone's doing. And it's just water. It's like that saying, right? Like, a fish doesn't know what water is. And I think there's a part of that as well that I you know was party to. And now looking back at it and living in London now, there's lots of innovation here in the UK and in London, but it does feel different than the Bay Area. And I can understand, I think, a little bit more why people question the startup journey more. But when you're living out there, it's just you're either working at a startup or you're doing your own, that sort of thing.
Super, super fascinating. I really appreciate you sharing that journey. You went over one area there reasonably quickly, from having the idea, facing the problem, to having an idea of doing something about it. Then you mentioned I convinced a friend to deliver it, so basically to help me deliver it. What did that journey look like, as far as you can and would like to talk about it, from sort of moving this initial seed of an idea to, yeah, moving closer to a product?
I think a lot of what I'm spending my time doing now is I also advise some startups. So I think that's a little bit about what you're talking about. And what we did in the early days of Energized AI, and any startup should do, is basically try to have these informational interviews and conversations with your potential customers. And you're not necessarily, and we did this too, like, you're not necessarily like pitching them, "Hey, I built this thing. Do you want to buy it?" That's later. That's different. You're more sort of saying, what, I'm really interested in helping solve a problem. I think maybe it's related to reliability, or you can even keep it vague. What are some of the biggest problems in EV charging? And so we went through this full process ourselves, talking with a lot of the folks that I used to work with, cold reach out on LinkedIn, all sorts of things, to talk to as many people as we can about, you know, EV charging is growing, but it's a difficult field because it's infrastructure and it requires utility work, which can take many years. And it's new technology in some ways with EVs, and public and humans like you and I are engaging with it, and we drop things and we're imperfect. So there's all these problems in it. What are some of the things that are the most difficult and complicated? And had a few of those early conversations, saw that this problem around, keeping chargers online and general uptime was a big issue. We heard that over and over again. And we sort of were thinking like, okay, this is a problem. We're hearing it many times. We're seeing a bunch of tech like publications and some mainstream ones talk about it. Then, like, are we the people to solve this? There are plenty of problems out there that I am not equipped to solve. There are more problems out there than there are that I'm equipped to solve. I try to know my own limitations. And so, like, a lot of it was then seeing, like, okay, so there's this maintenance component. And maybe with the maintenance area, we could apply some analytics and data scientists around it and understand this sort of composition of the charger that we talked about, but also what it's like to order parts, maybe pre-positioning parts. These are all sort of problems that can be, you know, made simpler and sometimes resolved through having a better understanding of where your parts are, getting the parts in the right location, in some cases, predictive maintenance if it gets to that. And those are all sort of classical data science type problems that can solve. Like, this is something you see in a totally different arena when you go on Amazon and they offer you next day delivery. They're basically doing this, but not for EV chargers and not the composition work, but of a charger. But they're basically saying, you live in this city, and within this city, we think so many X amount of people are going to need toothbrushes tomorrow, or something, or X amount of people are going to need whatever. And so we're going to pre-position those toothbrushes and have a stock there. And that's a data science problem Amazon solved. So there are many things, and I might, uh, without getting too much into it, we saw, okay, so there's a real problem. The industry knows it. We could be the people to solve it. There's no reason we're not the people to solve it. And then sort of started thinking about like what a business model could look like. How could we go about actually starting the company? All the sort of tactical blocking and tackling. How do you make a company? Like things like that. And yeah, it was a wild ride. More wild than I expected, but I'm happy I did it. Came out on the other side, and yeah.
In what way was it wilder than you expected it to be?
I think that every meeting, whether it's a meeting with a potential customer, when it's a meeting with a current partner, if it's a meeting with a potential hire, like every meeting when you are the small, like early stage startup that we were, is existential. And so if that customer wants to work with you, that's the best day. That's the best day of your life. And if they don't want to work with you, and they'll be gentle about it. No one's particularly rude, especially in California, but like that's the worst day of your life because you don't know what's going to happen with the startup. Same, and that's with every meeting. If you got someone smart to support and join the team, if you lost someone, if you um, found we won a grant during our time. And so did we win that grant? Did we lose a grant? Every single meeting. And I don't think I appreciated um, what that could do to me, like that constant, every meeting's the most important meeting type of thing.
Mm. On that sort of second question, so first question, what's the problem? You came to a conclusion, charger uptime is a problem that's probably worth solving to a larger set of organizations. Second question was around, are we well equipped to solve this problem? How did you come to the conclusion that you're well positioned, and how did you mentioned that you had some data science, maybe data engineering support? Where did these
Mm.
people come from? Did you hire them directly? Did they freelance for you? Did you do the work yourself? And how did you get access to the data? Were there some companies that you started working with? What does this sort of initial process look like?
Yeah, so much of the process was making sure that me and my co-founder could build most of this. We had help later, but it was important to me that we could build as much of it, the two of us, as possible. And by building, I mean like both the technical solution, but also the like company. Like could
Mm.
could we also speak to customers, build a front end that looks good, build a website that looks good, like things that sound trivial, but you still need to do those things. And those are sort of corporate development, like how do you build a company. And
Yeah.
so he and I did most of that. We had some help later, and those people were not always full time, but we got some help in the early days. And basically, then in terms of getting data, it was very hard. We had a good relationship with a university in California, and they allowed us to use some of their data to prove out what we worked on, and sort of took it from there, like at little wins here and there, and sort of building the trust between us and that university that gave us our first amount of data, between me and my co-founder, that we could build this thing and that we could take it to the next level, and then sort of going out and going to trade shows and speaking to customers and flying to different places to take meetings, that sort of thing. And like just really doing that hustle and giving ourselves some deadlines. Like you know, if we did not get funding, and in our case it was a grant because we had backup plans. We were talking with plenty of investors, and we were pitching and getting ready to start a round. And so it's all those contingency plans and deadlines around, if we don't hear back from one company, let's talk to the other. If we don't hear back from the grant, let's go back to these investors, and keeping everyone aware of what we were doing, so that no matter which direction we needed to go, we could have been flexible to it. Because in the early days of a startup, you need to keep all of those options open, because you have no idea where you'll get your break, who will talk to you, who will give you funding, how things will go.
Super, super interesting. Okay, so this was sort of stage one. What's your problem? Is it worth solving? Secondly, are we well equipped to solve it? Tick. Um, Third stage, you mentioned, okay, how do we solve this problem specifically around tech stack? I'm of course not gonna, given that some of this may be confidential, I don't know, but
Mhm.
I assume that throughout that process with amongst yourselves and then working with the teams and some of the partners that you mentioned, you came to certain conclusions around what the ideal tech stack would look like, and then you mentioned, okay, you need to demonstrate business value around this element of business value and sort of signing contracts. There's probably a little bit of a barrier. Could imagine. I've never been in this situation, but probably a little bit of a barrier when it comes to having sort of prototypes, MVPs, things that companies could test, and then actually commercializing that. So having people sign a contract, you would pay X dollar amount for this and enter a type of partnership. What did that last bit look like around actually quantifying value, articulating value, and then signing contracts?
Yeah, I mean, that's hard, right? That's really hard. And what it looked like was it's not, at least our startup journey, if you want to call it that, it was not one where, we showed up to a company and we showed them a really beautiful front end that had great back end data. And like, they're like, Adam, we've just been waiting for this. And like gave me a big hug and it worked. Like, that's not what it was at all. Right. And I say that because the approach that we took is, in the even earliest days of exploring the idea, like we had been talking about in that stage one, we kept many of our contacts in the industry and potential customers and potential partners. We kept them aware of everything, and we showed them as we were making progress. And the reason for that is because we really wanted and had and ultimately had a like design partner, someone you can work with that will spend with you a little bit of time and provide you feedback. Like, this is helpful. These are the things we're interested in. I remember one meeting where we had all of these hypotheses around what would be the most important things these customers, our potential customers, and would be looking at. Is it, power modules, like how often they need to change the power modules? Is it like connectors because there's no sensors in connectors. So that's like an area that even the best software in the world could never really understand when the connector is broken. There's some things around heat, but there's no direct, like the plastic thing that plugs into your car is broken. There's no sensor in that plastic. And so we had all these hypotheses. And then we were talking with someone at one of the EV charging companies in one of these sort of co-development ideation sort of conversations. And they're like, the metric we're most focused on and we see all the time is, did the customer plug in the car and have a charge start on the first try? Like and basically that's a technical way of saying like good or bad customer experience, right? And yes or no, would that customer come back? And that was like so illuminating. Like we were so deep in the technicalities and predictive maintenance and parts positioning and all of these things like I got excited about when we were talking about earlier, but they needed to understand what was the customer experience like and how to quantify it. And we got some ways towards doing that related to the ID card, and we leaned into that. But you need to have those conversations, and you need to have sort of an MVP so that these people that you're speaking with, even if they're friendly towards you, they at least know you're competent. You're not just a random person. You've got some competence. You've got maybe some rapport. In my case, it was a little bit easier because I spent so much of my career in charging. There was some there. If it was a new industry, I might have to demonstrate that or show that I understood at least some of the things that they were working on at a meaningful level. And then doing this co-development. And that's really the path that we took. And there were some companies that we spoke with that wanted to work with us, but it didn't work out between us. Like for many reasons that I can't go into detail. And there were some that it did work out with. And basically it was like a constant iteration um, until we had something that was interesting. And maybe skipping to step 5 or 6, just to share, like we had something interesting, but we weren't sure of the viability long term of the business. Charging operators, they have very low margins and they have very high costs for deploying the equipment. They're charging 20-30% margin on the electricity. They're not generating the electricity, they're buying it from a utility. They're putting some markup on it and they're delivering it to your car in a fast charger. And they've got millions of dollars per site of cost for construction, cost for the actual like charger, and then maintenance. And we helped with some of the maintenance costs, and that's where we had most of our savings. But we weren't sure. And it took us some time to get to this. And it took a lot of these conversations with our partners to understand that. And around that time of us having something that was interesting and understanding that we're not sure of the business, we had that offer from 7gen for the acquisition. I got along really well with the 7gen team, and it just made sense that we sort of sell the business, we integrate our technology with them. My co-founder went on to do other things. I went on to and still am working with 7gen as an advisor, and we sort of allowed ourselves to say like we think this is as far as we could take it, and it's not necessarily the next Uber. We've talked about them a lot. Maybe that's the next startup, but also we made something and we made some impact and we helped with some of this reliability, and someone wanted that technology and took that, and that's sort of how the journey sort of came to an end.
Is it public how much the company is sold for?
It's not public. What I can say is, look, it was a great journey, and I'm happy I did it, but there across the board in EV charging and even many EV startups, there's not wild swings of crazy dollar amounts. Like I'm happy and proud of what we built and how much we sold it for. Um, but I'm not, buying an island and retiring to it just yet.
Well, please do reach out when you study next Uber.
Yeah, exactly.
But no, thanks so much. Thanks so much, Adam. I really appreciate you making time for this today, and definitely made my day today. I love our conversation a lot.
Fabian, this was a lot of fun, and thanks for having the chat with me. And yeah, this was great.